If you're a student of Mississippi history, you might know that that's the Mississippi Monument at Shiloh National Military Park. And if you've been to Shiloh, you might recognize this as the railroad crossroads at Corinth. And if you've been in Corinth, you've been in the Corinth Civil War Interpretive Center just beside Battery Robinette. And if you've done all these things, you most assuredly have probably seen this picture of the Confederate dead that was taken the day after the Battle of Corinth here at Battery Robinette. You know, these guys all have a story, and well, today I'm going to introduce you to this guy, Colonel W.P. Rogers, and more specifically, his mother. Come along with us. Let's go explore. Today, we're in Oddfellows Rest Cemetery in Aberdeen, Mississippi, and I'm going to introduce you to a lady named Mary Miles Rogers and the rest of her family. If you come through these gates and basically bear to the right until you see the historical marker marking General John Gregg's grave, you'll be fairly close to the Rogers clan. Mary Miles Rogers was born in Georgia in 1796. Sometime before 1836, she met and married a guy named Timothy Rogers, and they moved from Jones County, Georgia, and they moved to Monroe County to a little bit south of the present-day Derrick community. Here's Mary, and Timothy is just to her left. Timothy and Mary had 7 children. Francis Marion Rogers was their oldest child, and he was born in 1816. William P. Rogers was born in 1817, Mary Eliza in 1820, Teresa Grace in 1825, Frances Ann in 1828, Elizabeth Alabama Rogers in 1832, and Timothy Lincoln Rogers was born in 1837. Not sure why, but Timothy the dad died on July the 29th, 1844. Just beside Mom, you see the grave of Elizabeth Alabama Rogers. She died on August 22nd, 1840, at the age of 8. And just to her left is Frances Ann Rogers, who died on September 12th, 1840, at the age of 12. I have no idea of the cause of death for these girls either. Right next to them, you have the grave of Mary Eliza Rogers Dunklin. She died on September the 15th, 1857. She had 3 children, and she was 37 years old. And right next to her, behind the same marker, is her oldest child, Anna Mary Dunklin. She died a week after her mother on September the 22nd. She was 19. My goodness, don't you know that by now Mary Miles Rogers has grown weary of coming out to this plot of ground in Oddfellows Rest Cemetery? I came out here to find the grave of Francis Marion Rogers and do a story on he and his brother when I stumbled upon this tragedy. If you make your way down by this row of the Rogers family, and you'll walk about 20 or 30 yards down toward a shiny white marker, you'll find the grave of Francis Marion Rogers. In 1837, Francis was working out of a law office on Chestnut Street in Aberdeen. He was appointed the circuit judge for the 6th District in 1845, and again in 52. He was a Whig and ran for governor of Mississippi in 1853. He lost his bid for governor right after he completed this home known as Magnolia Hill. Jefferson Davis would stay at Magnolia Hill when visiting Aberdeen. Francis had married Indiana Virginia Sykes in 1852. He was a busy guy in the early 1850s. I need to remind you to hit that like button, share on your favorite form of social media, and maybe subscribe. When the Civil War broke out, Francis Marion served in the Confederate Army and the 14th Mississippi Infantry Regiment, Company E. He was killed in action on February the 15th, 1862, at Fort Donelson. The newspaper reported that he was killed at the head of his company, and his body was borne from the field by a faithful domestic servant. That domestic servant would have been an enslaved individual. You know, Francis was killed in February of 1862, but that was not the only family death that Miss Mary had to endure that year. That's General John Gregg's grave off in the distance, and we'll turn back around to face the Rogers. On August the 30th, 1862, Miss Mary's grandson, Timothy Dunklin, was killed at 2nd Manassas. He is buried at Dunklin Cemetery in Virginia. Timothy was 21 when he was killed in action. The youngest of Miss Mary's children, Timothy L. Rogers, served with the 17th Mississippi during the Civil War. He died on September 12, 1869, 11 months after his mother. We're going to leave Oddfellows Rest Cemetery now so I can tell you the story about William Peleg Rogers. William P. Rogers established Aberdeen's first newspaper in 1837, and he named it the Aberdeen Whig. The Aberdeen Whig was reorganized in 1838, and in 1939 it was renamed the Aberdeen Whig and the North Mississippi Advocate. I'm not sure that William P. used the building you see before you to produce the Aberdeen Whig, but I am sure that the Aberdeen Whig eventually became the Aberdeen Weekly Publishing Company, and they most definitely used this building in the 1870s. You can still see parts of the faded Coca-Cola sign on the side of the building today. The Aberdeen Weekly Publishing Company produced newspapers in this building until about 1900. William P. Rogers started the newspaper industry in Aberdeen, but he left for Texas about 1841. We're in Corinth, Mississippi now, and we're going to take you up the hill toward Battery Robinette, right beside the Corinth Civil War Interpretive Center, and we're going to visit William's grave. It was October of 1862, on the second day of the Battle of Corinth, when Confederate Major General Earl Van Dorn had called for a series of attacks on heavily fortified Federal positions like Battery Robinette. Colonel William P. Rogers of the 2nd Texas Infantry was ordered to lead the vanguard of the assault on Battery Robinette. This fort anchored the center of the Union line, the railroad crossroads being just several hundred yards away. He remained on horseback, enduring a deluge of cannon and musket fire, and finally, carrying the regimental colors himself, Rogers reached the deep trench fronting Battery Robinette. He dismounted and led several hundred Texas and Alabamians down into the trench and up the steep embankment and into the fort. Federal reinforcements suddenly closed in from both sides, and Rogers shouted, "Men, save yourselves or sell your lives as dearly as possible." A few seconds later, he was struck by multiple musket balls and died instantly. The 2nd Texas lost more than half its men in the attack. Union General William Rosecrans ordered Rogers' burial to be attended with full military honors. This kind of ceremony was normally reserved for general officers. A newspaper reported that in front of Battery Robinette, Colonel William P. Rogers of the 2nd Texas led 3 separate assaults on this redan, stumbling over his dead each time. On the 3rd try, the works were carried, and Rogers was shot dead while standing atop the parapet. He was waving his battle flag and urging on his brave Texans. Of course, the next day came the photographers, and that's Colonel Rogers you see circled in red. Colonel Rogers was 44 years old. As we look around the top of present-day Battery Robinette, the place where so much brutal and catastrophic fighting took place, I would like to remind you of the Colonel's mother, Miss Mary Miles Rogers, and what 1862 brought her. Whatever you think of the cause her sons were fighting for, her pain in the fall and winter of 1862 was no less real a year after she had lost a grandson in the state of Virginia to war and her 2 oldest sons in the state of Mississippi. I hope you learned a thing or two as you met Mary Miles Rogers today, especially about the cost of war and the pain and suffering it brings. I personally don't find too much romanticism here. I urge you to pick up a book and read about the Battle of Corinth and come to the Corinth Civil War Interpretive Center and maybe even Aberdeen to Oddfellows Rest Cemetery to meet the Rogers for yourself sometime. Thank you.